Hi everyone, and welcome to the Be Brave podcast. I'm so glad you're here. Before we dive in, I want to give a quick trigger warning. This podcast will talk about child sexual abuse, trauma, and recovery. Please listen with care and kindness to yourself. If at any point you feel triggered, pause, take a break, and come back when you're ready. I'll share some helpline numbers at the end for anyone who needs support. And just so you know, throughout the series, we'll be using words like CSA, grooming, and other terms that might be difficult to hear. Please take care of yourself whilst listening. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Be Brave Project podcast. Today we're talking about trauma, how it impacts children and families, and what truly trauma-informed support looks like in real life. I'm joined today by Vashti Wickers, trauma-informed lead at the NSPCC, who brings over 30 years of experience working alongside children and families affected by adversity and trauma, both as a frontline practitioner and as a leader shaping change across the sector. Vashti, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited for this call. Before we talk about the work itself, I'd really love to start with you, because people don't step into this space by accident. Some people might, but I don't think that's really the case. I think people do this because there's a reason. So what first drew you to working with children and families?
Yeah, so I think my interest in people generally and how we behave started quite early on for me. Some of my own experiences growing up and the ways that I found myself responding to them, I suppose, sparked a bit of a curiosity about why people do what they do, how they behave, and especially when they're either under pressure or navigating difficult things. And I suppose as I got older, that curiosity didn't go away, it just grew, and it led me to want to study psychology. So I really had a desire to understand human behaviour. So I went and studied psychology and eventually went into my first role supporting children, young people who were leaving care. That was back when I worked at what was then called NCH Action for Children. And I met some incredible young people during that time, many of whom, or all of whom actually, had lived through really significant trauma. And it showed up for them in so many different ways. But what was always really striking for me was the sense that each of those young people were so unique in how they coped and how they expressed themselves. But one thing was always the same, which was the relationship, the power of relationship. So I really began, that was the kind of the first point that I really began to notice how connection and patience and compassion, empathy, all of those things that we hear could really create a difference for those young people. And a couple of them in particular taught me so much about what it means to children actually and young people to show up and just be consistent, to hold space for them, and most of all to believe in someone when actually the world might have told them otherwise. And that those experiences really stayed with me. They really shaped me, in combination with some of the things that I'd experienced myself. And I suppose ultimately they inspired me to pursue social work, which is what I actually chose to go into in the end, and a real focus on children and families. And from there, the rest is kind of history, as they say. I've worked with babies, children, young people, families who've experienced trauma for over 30 years. And, those first memories of my own combined with that first introduction to working with young people in trauma never leave me. They're always in the back of my mind as to why I do this.
Wow, yeah, thank you. I think that's incredible. And like I was saying, I don't think some people do probably fall into the sector by accident, but I genuinely think that there's always a reason, whether it's personal or whether you have a real connection to it. And I think having a personal connection does help. It can draw you and you can understand it a little bit more. You have more of the empathy and the sympathy around it as well.
Yeah.
So after more than 3 decades in the space, what continues to keep you committed to this work?
It's a great question. And if I'm honest, it's been really tough at times. There have been times when I felt like maybe I couldn't do it anymore, or I felt really frustrated. But ultimately, it's always been about possibility. So I think the possibility of change, the potential that lives within, all the babies, all the children, young people,
Mm.
and the difference that we as adults can make. There's something really rewarding about being alongside a child or a young person who begins to recognize their own strengths, sometimes for the very first time. That can be incredibly motivating. And I always say to people when I'm delivering training or whether I'm talking to people, even if you impact on one child, that's one life that you've improved or you've made better, and that's something really precious. So that, alongside also the fact that we know so much more now about the impact of trauma, particularly on the brain and the body, and as a consequence of that, we know lots more about what truly helps. So I think, again, paired with my own lived experience, I've come to understand that, it's often the smallest moments actually that create the biggest shifts. So it can be in a really gentle voice, or just being consistently present for someone noticing you, maybe, someone hearing you. And the biggest thing, I think, is someone holding hope for you when you're not quite able to hold it for yourself. And that's a really common impact of trauma, is that kind of difficulty holding hope. So it's all of those things that, and the potential that gives. I suppose one idea that I come back to, and I was thinking about this earlier this morning again and again, is something that Bessel van der Kolk says. So Bessel van der Kolk, for people that don't know, is a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist who's written and talks a lot about trauma and the impact of trauma in his work. And he talks about the fact that one of the deepest, most painful wounds of trauma isn't actually the event itself, but it's the experience of not being truly seen, truly heard, truly validated. And other experts, say the same, like Gabor Mate, for example, another childhood trauma expert, will say trauma is not the external event, but it's the internal wound that's left behind. Yeah. So it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you, that kind of sense of your emotions not being seen, not being taken into account, not being prioritized, all of those things, which then creates those feelings of kind of shame, potentially isolation. Yeah. And I was thinking about that this morning. I was thinking about my own experiences, and I suppose I can give an example of that just to sort of demonstrate how that works. So it seems like quite a simple example, but I just think it really clearly demonstrates, what we're talking about. So when I was 16, I was moved from where I'd been living throughout my secondary school education, which was in Cambridge, all the way down to Plymouth, which was hundreds of miles away. Wow. As a result of my dad getting a new job, essentially. On the outside, that might look like a family simply relocating. Teenagers move with their parents all the time. But internal wound for me, the true wound for me, wasn't the physical move from Cambridge to Plymouth, but it was what the move did to me inside. So at 16, I was in the middle of forming my identity, my connections, my sense of belonging. And so Cambridge wasn't just a place for me. It was like my anchor. I had friends who felt like my world, my first boyfriend. I was in my first relationship. Everything was familiar to me, the streets, the routine I was in, all those things that give you a sense of safety. And when that was taken away, the wound inside of me wasn't about geography. It was about the loss, the loss of my roots. And so the internal wound was like a wound of disconnection. I went from being someone who belonged to someone who felt completely cut off and not, didn't belong. That really sudden rupture from friendships, from developing my independence, from everything that I knew was familiar, left me really adrift. And, at that age, I didn't have the tools to kind of manage that separation. I would also say I had a wound of powerlessness. I tried with all my strength to stay, to make my voice matter, to have choice in my life. But obviously at 16, I had very little power to influence the outcome. And so the wound again came from the experience of not being heard in something that mattered hugely to me. And my attempts, so I tried to run away, I tried to resist. Yeah, I did all sorts of things, but they were just expressions of my need to be seen. I just wanted to be seen. I wanted to be understood. And looking back now, it wasn't, I also had a wound of loneliness. And not just loneliness because I was in a new place with no friends, but a kind of internal loneliness that formed because I didn't feel acknowledged. I didn't feel like my feelings were spoken about, didn't feel like I mattered. And I think I was also grieving. I was grieving like a significant loss. but I was carrying it on my own. So I was grieving, for the life that I loved, the friendships that I'd lost. And at 16 back then, it's a very long time ago, there were no such thing as mobile phones. There was no such thing as mobile phones. So, it was not possible to keep in contact with people in the way that it would be now. So the world that I knew just disappeared almost overnight. And I think that kind of rupture creates an internal narrative that maybe things that I love can be taken away without warning. So it left me in a state of vigilance, of trying to protect against that happening again. And so that wound lasted. It lasted for me. The feelings were too big for me to navigate at that point. So they stayed inside me, and they've definitely found their way into later experiences of relationships and my sense of self. So going back to the question, I've gone off on a bit of tangent there, but going back to the question, what keeps me committed is knowing that things can be different, just by showing babies, children, young people that they matter, that their voice is important, that their needs actually do make sense, that their emotions are welcome, and really importantly, that they can speak without that fear of being shamed or punished for something. So the hopeful part, the part that kind of keeps me in this work, is knowing that adults, professionals, carers can all play such a massive role in rebuilding that sense of being valued, being understood. We can help restore what was missed, and those wounds can be healed. So the practitioners that show up for this work every day, the children, young people who keep showing up, that's what inspires me, and that's what keeps me committed.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing your experience as well, and that answering that question in so much depth. That's incredible. And I think it makes so much sense why you do what you do, and you are committed to the work. It's so important, and everything, all the points that you made make so much sense. Love how you want to make children feel like they have that voice, because for so many of them, regardless of whether they've had specific trauma or like what I had, child sexual abuse, it's not that. It's giving the child autonomy and allowing them to feel like they are being heard. And of course, yes, they can't make massive, big decisions because they are children. I'm going from my experiences with my daughter. She's 8 at the moment, and she's a very outspoken, very independent little girl, and I love that about her. But a lot of the time, she says to me, "But why can't I do? Why can't I make a decision?" And it's really difficult, because I'm thinking, you can't, because you're 8 and I'm the parent and I have to make the decisions. But I also do not want to be that person that stops you from speaking. And it's a fine line, though, because I'm very open with her. I do say to her, "But darling, it's because you're a child. When you're older, you will be able to make these big decisions, but I'm still going to listen to what you want and what you need."
I think that's right, Chloe. I think it's a bit about saying to children, look, your voice is important and it doesn't matter, and I'm going to hear it, but also being honest and upfront, in terms of actually, but I'm your parent and I'm responsible for you. Whilst you're a child, I am responsible for you. So I need to make sure that the decisions are the good ones and the right ones, and the ones that can keep you safe, and the ones that are going to keep you alive. So I think there is that explanation of your voice absolutely does matter. Sometimes I am going to have to make the decisions because I'm responsible for you until you're older. And I think that's okay. I think children do well with explanations. It's when they don't have the explanation, when they're not listened to and they don't understand why no one's taking them into account, that's where it's painful.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's just being open and honest with them, just explain, I'm listening to you, but this is why we can't do what you're wanting to do. This is why I can't give you ice cream every single night for dinner, because of X, Y, and Z.
Exactly. And we do that for adults, right? We explain to each other why we're not doing things or why we are doing things. So why would we not give children the same respect, really? Yeah.
Definitely. Well, I'd love to move on to how this shows up in practice as well. And listening to you, it's like I said, it's clear how much depth and experience you bring. But I'd love to spend some time helping listeners really understand trauma and what it looks like beyond the label, I suppose. So, trauma informed is a phrase we hear a lot, especially a lot more now with everything that's going on. What does it actually mean in real life practice?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, actually, because like you say, we hear it a lot at the moment. It's becoming more and more recognised, which is a good thing. But also we have to make sure that we truly understand what we're talking about. So At its simplest, I suppose, being trauma informed means understanding and recognise the impact of trauma and how that can affect babies, children, young people, and adults. But in practice, it's so much more than that awareness. So it's about taking that understanding and allowing it to influence how we respond in the moment, in our relationships, in services, and actually even in how we move through the world. I'm always kind of saying to people, like, this isn't about something you just do when you show up at work. It's actually about how you are, how you respond to people, how you are in relationships. So it's a way of paying attention really to how we treat ourselves and each other. And it's also it's making a choice to use what we know works as a lens through which we see all of our activity, all of our decision making, and all of our service delivery. But I think more importantly than that, trauma informed practice isn't just like a checklist of things. It's not like a set of token gestures. It's not, as I say, it's not something you switch on at work and then it turns off at home. It's a real commitment to doing things differently. And for me, that is a way of being. It's how we show up every single day in our personal lives, in our professional roles, and in all the small interactions that fill the spaces in between. So everywhere every space we occupy, at its heart, it means coming from a place of compassion and curiosity. So it means being willing to just pause sometimes and look beneath someone's behaviour. So rather than just taking what we see in front of us at face value, we ask ourselves, what might be happening for that person, for that child? What's today been like for them? What happened last week? What happened to them as a child? It's holding in mind always that behaviour is a form of communication, always. It's always telling us something. There are also well-established principles that guide trauma-informed practice. So they were developed originally by an organisation called SAMHSA in America. And it is interesting and important to recognise those principles because they came out of very extensive research with contributions not only from practitioners and academics, but most importantly from people with lived and living experience of trauma. Mm. And so they hugely, massively contributed to thinking about those principles and really what works when you're with someone who's experienced trauma. And those principles really help us to stay grounded in what truly matters. So the most commonly known or recognised principles are safety, trust, collaboration, empowerment, and also cultural context. So understanding the role of culture and context. Yeah. But ultimately, trauma-informed practice for me comes back to something really deeply human. And we've talked about this already, and how we see people, how we listen, how we make people feel. So it's really about creating spaces wherever you are. So whether you're delivering a service, whether you're at home, whether you're in a school, within your team at work, and just within our communities, where spaces where people feel valued, believed, and understood. And that essentially is what we mean by trauma-informed practice.
Great. I think that's really important what you just said, just showing up and giving space to people. And I suppose a trauma-informed approach, not everyone is going to necessarily understand it, and I think I'm just generalizing here, but from my experiences, I'm obviously very trauma-informed, working for the NSPCC, having my personal experiences. But when I bring it up, I do feel like some people get a little bit scared about it, and I think they hear the word and they think, oh God, it is spoken about a lot more, which is definitely important. And I think a lot of, and I again don't want to generalize, but I think it potentially is a generational thing as well, because it wasn't spoken about and it wasn't really a thing. Talking more about my parents' generation, really, because it wasn't a thing. They're like, oh, we just got on with it and we just did this.
Yes.
Yeah, but that wasn't the right way of going about it. I think a lot of people get a bit scared about it, I think.
Yes. I think we know so much more now, to be fair. In the previous generation, the research, the knowledge, the experiences weren't understood in the way that they are now. So I think people did just get on with it and it did the best that they can. And I think one of the things about trauma-informed is it's not about blame. It's not about making parents, for example, feel bad. It's understanding that people on the whole, majority of the time, do the best that they can within the circumstances they've got. But what we have now is we do have much more information and we do have much more knowledge. And so I think it's about people taking the responsibility to learn and to know about these things and, to be responsible for your children and your colleagues and your friends and your family. So it's not as scary. It's nothing to be frightened of, but I do think every individual has a responsibility to understand and know about it and be able to challenge ourselves and reflect on how we behave towards other people. I think a lot of practitioners come to me and say, oh, this is what we do anyway, which is true to some extent. Relational practice has been around for years and years. And, there are elements of that are very similar. But I think the trauma-informed world is different in terms of the specific nature of, knowing what we know now about trauma and what helps. So, I don't want people to be frightened of it. I just want what I encourage people to do is just reflect on it, learn about it, reflect on it and understand what you can do differently.
Definitely. And I think moving on to my next question goes into this, what happens when services and systems and people aren't trauma-informed?
The challenge here is that we can actually do more harm. That's the reality. We can risk the potential for re-traumatization and that goes for individuals or groups, actually. It doesn't just mean it's a person, it could be groups as well. So there are several things I think that can happen. And I was kind of thinking about this previously around the different places that this can show up. So first of all, I suppose when you're thinking about like the NSPCC, for example, people coming into systems can feel unsafe. So if we're not trauma informed, if we don't give people predictability, choice, empathy, and if those things aren't built in, then services can feel really punitive, they can feel disorientating, they can feel controlling. And for people with trauma histories, that can activate survival responses, the fight or flight, freeze, which makes engagement nearly impossible for people. So typically what might happen as a result of that is an increase in distress. People might avoid services or actually completely withdraw from services. And then, of course, people get labelled with things like non-compliant or non-engaging, which actually, in fact, is a fear-driven response. So that's the first thing. People experience the system as unsafe. Then also behaviour gets misinterpreted. So in non-trauma-informed systems, trauma responses could be misunderstood as defiance or laziness or manipulation or just having a poor attitude. And that then, particularly for children and young people, we see that leading to some inappropriate sanctions, being punished for things. Exclusion is an example of that, exclusions in schools. And that then impacts on people that are already marginalised. So that's a really key one, not understanding behaviour. And then if you think about staff working within systems, without a trauma-informed framework, staff can take behaviours personally. Compassion fatigue grows, burnout increases, blame replaces curiosity, working in systems where there's a lot of blaming and shaming. And so then people working in the systems also end up working in survival mode. So you generate this organisational trauma, which is really difficult to work in and certainly almost impossible to provide services to children and young people within. Within systems as well, power imbalances, should I say, widen. So, non-trauma informed systems reinforce power over people rather than power with. So you get that control rather than that collaboration, focus on processes rather than people. And that's again where you get environments where individuals feel disempowered, they feel voiceless, and then you start to replicate the dynamics of trauma. That's the really key message, I think. You replicate the dynamics of trauma. That's a really important message. So re-traumatization then becomes common. And that's the biggest risk. Systems can unintentionally replay elements of past trauma. So things like loss of control, not being believed, being shamed, maybe being forced or coerced. And certainly, again, the theme keeps coming up, having no voice in decisions. So even like routine processes can become things that really activate people when that system lacks sensitivity. I also think it's really important to talk about inequities, because I think in a non-trauma informed system, those inequities worsen because we know trauma disproportionately affects marginalised groups. We know that. And so, you can get an exacerbation of racial disparities. You can get a reinforcement of gendered and social inequalities. We can very easily fail neurodivergent people, for example. And it can feel like we can punish people with invisible disabilities or care histories, those things that you don't necessarily know about and you can't see.
Mm-hmm.
So in short, in kind of summary, I think the system generally becomes least accessible to the people who need it most.
Yeah.
That's essentially what happens.
It's really important, that re-traumatization that you said. And from someone that has experienced childhood trauma, and when I went and I used services and systems that we call the justice system, for instance, and I've got a real thing about it, but I'm not going to necessarily dive into it in this episode. But from somewhere like the justice system that is there to, well, is meant to be there to protect victims and survivors of these horrific crimes, how badly they are not trauma informed. And I mean, I think I've spoken about this in other episodes as well. I think it's a postcode lottery in that sense. Some people have had amazing experiences and have had people that have been working with them during their investigation and the court case that have been very trauma informed and have been fantastic. And then other people have had such bad experiences. And I had a very bad experience where the people that were investigating the case were not trauma informed, not necessarily because it was their fault. They just didn't have the information and how to deal with it. And I was constantly felt to feel blamed and shamed, and I constantly questioned, does he believe me? I don't feel like he's believing me, because he said, this is the detective. He was great, and he managed to get everything there, and I got a guilty verdict. So I don't want to shame that much, but it wasn't his fault necessarily, but he wasn't trauma informed enough. The things that he used to say to me, I'd be thinking, what? You can't say that. For instance, he was arrested and they said, but he comes across like a really nice guy. Oh, okay.
Oh goodness, yeah.
He probably does. But all of those sort of things, the systems for me, I think they need to have more training. And I think there's also an element of funding, and I get that as well. Underfunded massively to have the training that they so badly need when victims of child sexual abuse or child sexual violence or whatever it may be. They need to be informed and how to deal with it. But I'm going off in a bit of a tangent now.
It's interesting to hear. And it's true, Chloe. Sadly, we hear lots of people having the same experiences, and I think that's where the system responsibility comes in, isn't it? And they're really taking what we know again and making sure that we use it. And the thing about finances, as you say, that it costs, and there's funding issues, but actually in the long term, if we did this across all organisations, it would save money, because it would save all the other money that we're losing on what happens when people experience trauma and the behaviours and the things they get into. So yes, something to keep thinking about all the time.
Yeah, definitely. And to keep pushing for, because it's so needed and it's so incredibly important. I also want to make space for how systems respond. So talking about what we were just touching on, what do you think is the biggest gap you've seen between policy and what actually happens on the ground?
Yeah, so I think this is again a really good question, and a really common thing, unfortunately, that we do see. One of the biggest gaps that I notice is the difference between knowing this stuff and actually doing it. So again, connecting into what you said there about training, there is a place for training, but that's a start. That's a start in the journey. Actually, the gap is knowing that stuff and then doing it. So many organisations now have, beautifully written trauma-informed policies, full of the right language and the right intentions and the right principles. So on paper, it all looks exactly as it should, but translating that into the everyday reality of practice is where things do sometimes fall apart. I think trauma-informed work for me isn't just a mission statement or a poster on the wall or a one-off training or a list of buzzwords. It's relational, it's embodied, and it requires people to actually show up differently. And I think that's where the gap often appears. In real life, I often see policies that talk about compassion and curiosity, but systems then that are leaving staff too stretched to offer either. And so when people are overwhelmed, they default to survival mode, and organisational what we know is that organisational survival mode is very rarely trauma informed. And I'm
Yeah.
sure lots of people would understand that. Services often do emphasise safety and trust, but then we have environments that are rushed, unpredictable, under-resourced. So that means that trauma-informed approaches aren't consistent. Organisations often do ask staff to be reflective, which is a really key element of being trauma-informed, but then don't give them time, don't give them protected time or supportive spaces to do it. And trauma-informed practice relies on adults, practitioners feeling regulated enough to be able to co-regulate. And so again, that requires investment. Another thing that I see is like a focus on individual behaviour without considering the behaviour of the system. So we can't ask practitioners to be calm and patient and regulated if the organisation they work in isn't.
Yeah.
So again, that's a gap. So if the real gap in all of this is policies are often trauma informed, but the conditions that people work in are not. And until the system is as trauma aware as the staff are expected to be, the practice will never fully match the policy. And I think as a trauma informed lead, that's one of my biggest challenges. At its heart, trauma informed practice requires that cultural change, not just procedural change. It asks organisations to prioritise relationships, to value the emotional labour of our work, and to keep coming back to the question of what does this feel like for the people experiencing it? What does it truly feel like? So when we are able to align policy with the lived and living experience of babies, children, families and staff, that's when trauma-informed practice really becomes possible. But until then, we will always see that gap.
And I think it's, from what you're saying, it's very much people want to have that policy in place because that's the right thing that they should be doing as an organisation. It's very easy to put it up on the wall and say, we're doing it, this is what we're doing, but they're actually not doing it. And I suppose it's very similar to any kind of safety awareness that you have to do in an organisation. You have the policies all written, but whether you're actually implementing it, it's a completely different thing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, and if what you're in and the environment that you're in is not, then how can you possibly actually implement that policy? But then I suppose it does, and you mentioned a few times, it comes down to funding, it comes down to all of that. It is always coming down to funding and how much money people have and how much time that they can spare, which is...
I think that there's an element of that, of funding, but I think there's so much that can be done that doesn't require funding. So there's so much that can be done around, I talked about just now, around relationships, prioritising relationships in an organisation, thinking about how we interact with each other. And that question, how is this feeling for someone? None of that takes funding. That's all about how we show up in our work. So yes, of course, there's an element of that around that kind of initial training and resources perhaps that you might want to access, but there's a huge part of it that takes no funding at all. It just takes reflection, asking ourselves the right questions, thinking about how we show up as human beings. So
yeah, definitely. And I think that's very important. But I suppose as someone that is trauma informed or has experience, I am very understanding about that. But I suppose if people haven't, and I think it's trying to get that across, isn't it? To say how important this is. Don't just look at it on a piece of paper. It's how you show up. It's how you treat people. And I think the more people that do it, the easier it does become.
Hugely, Chloe. That's a big thing for an organisation, again, like the NSPCC. I think one of my kind of key, aspirations is the more individuals operate like this, the more individuals do show up like this, the more it cascades through the organisation. So it's definitely there's a modelling element to it as well. There's a modelling that behaviour, and that's why it comes back to it's about who you are and how you are in your being. That's important, because if you can demonstrate that, if you can model that, then other people start to see it and they start to believe it. It's not just word, it's actions, and it's how you make them feel. So I think that's a massive part of it. And that's my hope for a huge organisation like ours, is that it will start to filter through everything that we do. And that's how we become truly trauma informed.
I want to make sure that we also talk about healing and hope before we close, because I think that's from someone that has lived experience, and for everyone that's listening that has lived experience, that is such an important part of it. And something that stands out in your work is the way that you bring both professional knowledge and lived understanding. And that human connection is often what changes everything for a child, like you've mentioned. So how has your lived experience shaped how you approach your work and leadership?
Yeah, I mean, massively. As a child and young person and adult, I've experienced my fair share of adversity and trauma, as have many, many people. My experiences have definitely impacted the way that I see myself, how I behave in relationships, and how I see the world and myself within that world. It's only really recently that I've truly begun to understand how my experiences have shaped me. And also, and this is important for probably people listening as well, also to start to truly accept that it wasn't my fault. And actually, the way that I responded to things was an attempt just to feel okay and to survive really hurtful experiences. So I've got a lot more acceptance, I feel a lot less blame. I still carry a good chunk of shame with me at times, but I do recognise and notice when it shows up now, which means I'm better at managing it. But my lived experience sits at the heart of everything that I do, every conversation I have, every decision I make, and the kind of leader that I strive every day to be. Through my childhood, my adolescence, and even into adulthood, I've walked through various types of adversity and trauma, and I know I'm not alone in that. So many people carry their own private battles, but my experiences, have definitely shaped the way that I am. I think the journey that I've been on has changed how I lead. It's taught me to listen really deeply, to notice the pain that people don't always name, and to create spaces where others feel seen and as safe as they possibly can. My experiences, I wouldn't say they define me, but they have shaped a really fierce commitment to leading with compassion, with honesty, with humanity. And that, more than anything, is really what drives me in my work.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think I've always thought that my lived experience has defined me, but I loved how you just worded that. I love that. It doesn't define you, but it's really made it, it's made you who you are, and it shaped you as a person. But you're no longer allowing it to define everything about you. And actually, there's a massive part of people that have childhood trauma or any kind of trauma. It's really difficult to not allow that trauma to be everything that you are. It is a massive part of who you are. Of course it is. It always will be. Trying and not to allow it to be everything. I'm not just someone that has childhood trauma. I'm not just someone that has experienced child sexual abuse. I'm also all of these other things. And I think that's also really important as well. And it does shape who you are and how you work and your leadership.
I think that's a really important thing for children and young people to hear as well, Chloe, that because I think sometimes we do define children and young people by their experiences or by what's happened to them. And actually, your point around seeing the whole child, the whole young person and all the other things that they are, and having that strengths-based approach that every child, every person has got their own strengths. And so seeing through that and also helping the individual themselves to see that is so important in moving on through life and creating that hope that's so crucial.
Yeah, definitely. For survivors listening today, what would you want them to hear?
I'd want them to know, first of all, how incredible they are. I don't think anyone who's lived through adversity or trauma has done something remarkable. They survived in whatever way they needed to, whatever coping strategies you used to get through those moments were strengths. They were acts of protection, acts of survival. You did what you needed to do to stay safe, and that's something to honour, and not hide. Our brains and our bodies are extraordinary in the ways that they step in to shield us. But the very fact that people are here, they're listening to this, is proof of, your resilience. Secondly, I think that you're not alone. Lots of people carry experiences that might echo parts of your story. There are people who will see you and hear you, who will meet you with compassion and not judgment, which unfortunately is sadly what people experience. If you do need to reach out, please know there's no shame in that either. In fact, the connection is a really powerful part of recovery and of healing. And there is hope. We've touched on hope, Chloe, a few times.
Yeah.
There is hope. Recovery is not only possible, it's happening around us every day in lots of different ways. So with everything that we understand now about trauma and healing, there are so many different paths available. There's no single route forward. Like for some people, self-healing is good and works. For others, support from professionals or your peers or your community can become an anchor. But what matters most is it's your path. You're unique. Your story, your pain, your responses, and your courage, they belong to you. There's no right or wrong way to feel or to cope or to heal. Your timeline is your own. You don't have to measure your trauma against someone else's or compare your journey to someone else's. How we respond to trauma is shaped by so many different things, particularly, well, especially who was there for us, who wasn't there for us, both at the time and afterwards. So wherever you are in your healing, in your journey, you're already doing something brave, and you deserve kindness, hope, and gentleness, I think, every step of the way. Yeah. So that would be my message, I think.
Oh, thanks, Vashti. That was beautifully put. And I'm listening to you, I'm smiling from ear to ear because I'm really taking all of that in and I'm thinking, listen to it, Chloe.
Yes.
Listen to what she's saying. I need to take on my own advice and your advice because I'm doing what I'm doing. There are days where you need to hear that. You really need to hear that. And so thank you. I think I needed to hear that today. That was beautifully put. So thank you so much. As we start to come towards the end of our conversation, and it's gone so quickly, so wonderful to speak to you. I do really want to focus on what comes next and to what needs to change and where hope, and I know we've mentioned that a lot, lives in this work. So my last question to you would be, where do you see hope across the sector?
Yes, I do see lots of hope. I see hope in the growing number of individuals, of teams, of organisations that are no longer seeing trauma-informed as just a kind of a thing or like an optional add-on, but really a core part of how we operate. And the conversations are definitely shifting. I think I hear much more deepening conversation go on, and there's a real sense of collective responsibility emerging, I think. And that, you can see there's momentum building across the UK that's impossible to ignore now. Scotland and Wales have been leading the way for some time, demonstrating what those trauma-informed principles really look like. But I think their early commitment has definitely paved the way for broader systemic change, and given the rest of the UK a bit of a living example of what is possible. But yeah, we're seeing encouraging movement. We've got national working groups, we've got cross-sector alliances, we've got grassroots networks that are doing really incredible work to push this agenda forward, and more organisations, from health to education to criminal justice to social care, are openly committing to working differently. And what gives me particular hope is the kind of shift away from, again, we touched on this slightly earlier, but the shift away from the misconception that being trauma-informed begins and ends with training. Increasingly people are starting to recognise the nuance and the depth that's required, and understanding and thinking about the culture, leadership, yes, policy, but relationships, and the everyday micro interactions. I love that phrase, but the everyday micro interactions that really support and define someone's experience. So it's about systems, not sessions. We are seeing also a growing appetite for reflective practice. So at NSPCC, I'm just about to roll out a reflective practice model. We're seeing much more co-production. We're seeing much more organizational self-awareness, and importantly, leaders. So leaders who are willing to be vulnerable, willing to model humility, and humanity in their work. So I think there is, across the sector, a widening acknowledgement that trauma-informed practice isn't just something we deliver, it's something that we embody. And I come back to that phrase of embodiment. It's something that who we are, what we do, our whole being. So that shift from performative to transformative is where the real hope lies, I think. Yeah.
I think that's a really positive end to the call, because it's nice to hear that someone that's in this work, that you can see it changing and it is getting better. And yeah, I love the embodying it and not just using it as, oh, okay, I've ticked a tick off the training, I've done it, that's fine now, I've done what I needed to do. No, actually really embody it. It's not just changing, it's everything that you do and what you bring to it. Yeah, Vashti, thank you, not just for this amazing conversation that we've had, but for the work that you've dedicated your life to. You really have put everything into it and you're making a huge difference. So thank you ever so much for coming on and speaking with me today, but everything that you do. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honour, and an honour to come on this podcast, and an honour to be involved in the work that we do, and I don't forget that. I remember that every single day. It's my privilege to be doing it. So thank you, Chloe.
No, thank you so much, Vashti. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure everyone that's listening has taken a lot from this today. Yeah, thank you ever so much, and I'll speak to you soon. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Be Brave Project. If anything we spoke about today has affected you, please remember this: you are not alone, and you deserve support. There are people and organisations ready to listen, to believe you, and to help you through whatever you're facing. Support is available, and you'll find the helpline numbers just below. Please take care of yourself, be gentle with your heart, and remember, being brave doesn't mean being unafraid. It means choosing to keep going. And I'm so proud of you being here. Until next time.